y'all. All right, Vancouver. This is my first time in Vancouver. Thank you. Wow, it started without me. That's a good way to start, right? Jumping the gun. I love how gloomy it was this morning. I'm from Texas, so I'm a collector. Yeah, all right. All right. I'm a collector of gloom, living in Texas. Like, I come up here for the gloom. Like, get me cold and cloudy. It's what I want. All right, let's have some fun. If you don't know me, or you're not super familiar with my work, I first got known for doing these things. What I do is I take an article from the New York Times, and I start making boxes around words that pop out at me. And I start collecting some of those words and turn them into little funny phrases or sayings. And when I'm done, I black out everything I don't need. This is what it looks like when I'm done. Sort of looks like if the CIA did haiku. Or the Mueller report, if you've read that recently. So, this is my ode to Texas. In Texas, there is nothing but Texas. This one's called Overheard on the Titanic. I mean, yes, we're sinking, but the music is exceptional. Do we have any married folks here? Who's married here? Show of hands. All right, excellent. I've been married, this is my 13th year of marriage, and this is my ode to marriage. What is marriage? Marriage is two people in love standing in the same bathroom. So these were collected in my first book, Newspaper Blackout, and after Newspaper Blackout came out, I did this series of books about sort of like how to build a more creative life in the digital age. And so today I'm kind of like going to distill those 3 books into 10 points. If I had to sort of sum up the great message of my books, it's that creative is not a noun. I don't like using the word creative as a noun because I think it breaks the world up into people who are creative and people who are not creative. I used to work in advertising, and I always felt like the creative team needed to think more like accounts, and accounts always needed to think more like creatives. So I'm very interested in this idea that creativity is not it's not something that you possess, it's something that you do. And I stole this from the great comedian John Cleese. He says, creativity is not a talent, it is a way of operating. So that creativity is not so much a noun, like a thing that you possess, it's more like a verb, it's a thing that you do. So I think if you forget about the noun creative and think more about the verbs of creativity, creativity is a tool and it's something that you can get better at. So I want to give you like sort of a 10-point course here this morning in how to be more creative in your work and in your life. Hopefully it's fun, so let's do it. Number 1, you don't have to be a genius. Whew, thank God, right? So this is sort of the cartoon version of how I think a lot of people think creative work gets done, right? You have the great genius sort of drop down on Earth, these sort of superhumanly talented people, and they sort of drop down to Earth and they, connect with the muse or God or their inner spirit or whatever, and this stuff just sort of vomits out of them, right? And they give it to us all, and we're all sort of like left to like gaze in awe at them. Whoa, and here it goes. And so this is the lone genius theory of creativity, right? Like there are special people in the world that are superhumanly gifted and they give things to us. They're tapped in, great geniuses. The thing about this idea that I don't like is it sort of cordons off the rest of us, right? Like I said before, there's an alternative to the lone genius theory, and it comes to us from the musician and record producer Brian Eno, and that is scenius. Okay, so genius is the collective form of genius. It's a sort of retelling of the story of creativity. So if you take every great lone genius that you ever heard of, let's take Beethoven, for example. Beethoven's one of the closest things to a great genius that we really had, right? So you think of genius, Beethoven's this great, superhumanly talented genius, right? Except when you start reading about Beethoven. Yes, superhumanly talented in some ways, but he had this very, very rich scene of people around him, people who were stealing and sharing with each other. He's born into a very musical family, right? He's born into Bonn, Germany, this very musical place. He moves to Vienna, where the emperor's super into music, right? Finds a huge group of colleagues, and more importantly, has a great audience to listen to him, right? So genius sort of retells the story of creativity. If you think about it in terms of genius is an ecosystem, right? Great people up top. Genius is more like an ecosystem. So if you buy into the idea of genius, it sort of changes the way you think about creativity and the way you sort of set up your life. Because it's not just about like cording yourself off and like trying to become that great genius, right? The people who really thrive in a genius are people who are connected to really good minds, right? So if we think about genius, we stop worrying about being a genius, and we start worrying about locating ourselves in rich networks of people who can help us sort of become the creative people we are. I think genius sort of retools your mind for doing great work. So you start thinking about your household as a genius, right? You start thinking about your workplace as a genius. You start thinking about your city as a genius. You start thinking about your country, your world as a genius. So forget about being a genius. Worry about how to build really great geniuses, because that brings us all into the story of creativity together. We'll talk about genius a little bit later. Number 2, steal like an artist. All right, so here's how I think artists look at the world. First, you figure out what's worth stealing, and then you move on to the next thing. Okay, when you look at the world this way, you sort of like don't have to worry about what's good art and what's bad art. There's only what's useful to you and what's not useful to you. Now, I feel like artists know this thing that they're not always forthcoming about, and that is that nothing that we do is completely original, right? All creative work that we do, it builds on what came before. And a lot of great ideas are just 1 or 2 ideas mashed up into a new idea, right? We're sort of a remix or a mashup of what we let into our life. Now, sometimes people ask me about this word steal, right? They're like, Austin, man, like why you gotta use that word steal? Like, why can't you be influenced like an artist? And I say, well, I use the word steal because I'm not very original, right? Pablo Picasso, he said, art is theft. Someone once asked the late, great David Bowie if he was original. He said, no, I'm more like a tasteful thief, He said the only art that he would ever study is the stuff that he could steal from.
It comes down to trying to expose yourself to the best things that humans have done, and then try to bring those things in to what you're doing. I mean, Picasso had a saying, he said, good artists copy, great artists steal. And we have, always been shameless about stealing great ideas.
Kurt Vonnegut, he says, if you're gonna steal, steal from the best. You might not have heard of this dude, but you probably heard what he said. He said, if you steal from one author, it's plagiarism. If you steal from 100 authors, it's research. Right? Bob Dylan, maybe one of the U.S.'s great creative thieves, he said, you steal a little, they throw you in jail. You steal a lot, and they make you a king or president. All right. But the guy, I think, who said it best, and where you hear that, you hear that phrase, bad artists copy, great artists steal, right? It really comes from T.S. Eliot. And what he said is, he said, immature poets copy, and great poets steal. But then he said this thing that's really crucial, and you have to listen to this part. The great poet takes what he's stolen and he welds it into something completely different from what it was stolen from, right? So it's not where you take things from, it's where you take things to. And I think what Elliot was talking about is that there really is honor amongst thieves, right? There's good stealing and there's bad stealing. So you have to think about, are you honoring what you're stealing from, or are you degrading it? Are you studying what came before you, or are you just skimming off the top of what's really trendy today? Are you stealing from many, or are you stealing from one? Are you crediting what you steal from, or are you plagiarizing? Are you transforming things, or are you imitating? Because, we all hear that, right? Imitation is flattery. No, it's not, right? You ever been copied before? It's not flattery. Transformation is flattery, taking something and taking it to a different place. So it's sort of the difference between a remix and a ripoff. And the way I kind of think about this honor amongst thieves thing is it's like, say you're stuck in an elevator with someone you've stolen from, right? Do they sort of like pat you on the back and say, hey, that was pretty cool what you did with my stuff, right? Or do they punch you in the face? That's kind of how I go for it. So I love opening because I want to, after this point at the end, I want you to do what my friend Wendy McNaughton says. Rip off everyone you meet, right? You're at this cool conference. There's going to be so many cool people. There will be cool people up on stage, but I really want to encourage you. It's really the people that are sitting around you right now that have the really interesting stuff, right? So get to know the people around you. Everybody's got one little gem of something, right, that you can take away from them. But you take those little bits and pieces that you've stolen, you take them back to your desk when you're done with all this, and you weave them into something of your own. And that's what the like an artist part of in stealing, right? All right, number 3, write the book you want to read. I'm going to keep this kind of brief. I think all really great work starts from a fan's perspective. I think if you want to get fans, you have to be a fan first. And I think, our great gifts as creative people are sort of brought to us through the gifts of others. You see work out in the world that you're really inspired by, and you want to do that work too, right? So I think about this a lot as a writer. This is sort of my flow chart for writing and reading books. It's like, if I want to read a book about something, is there a book about X? Yes, I read it, right? And I repeat this process over and over. I keep reading until I run out of books to read on the topic that I want to read about, and if I can't find it, then I write that book, right? I write the book I want to read. So think about that with your work. Think about where are the gaps out. Think about your scenius. Think about the scene and the network. Where are the little gaps that you can fill with your own efforts, right? So it's write the book you want to read, design the software you want to use, record the music you want to listen to, run the business you want to see run, do the work you want to see done out in the world. Number 4, use your hands. Okay, so one of my favorite people in the world is this cartoonist named Linda Berry. And she has this great saying. She says, in the digital age, don't forget to use your digits, right? We're all staring in front of those rectangular glass screens now, right? It's very hard sometimes to feel like we're using our hands. And, I think really great creative work is like a whole body experience, right? You're using all 5 senses, and you're sort of pulling your whole body into it. And it's very hard when you're sitting down with a mouse in front of Photoshop, right, to get that going. I think great art doesn't just come from the head. I think it also comes from the body. And I think the mind-body connection is sort of a two-way street, okay? So here's a little hack I use in my studio to make sure that I'm sort of like bringing my hands into my work and into my and bringing my body into things. And you can this is a real easy thing to do in your office space or like if you go back to work. So what I do is I have bless you, I have 2 desks in my studio, a digital desk and an analog desk. And the digital desk, it sort of looks like, every other open office plan desk, right, out there, computer, maybe a Wacom tablet, or, big noise-canceling headphones, That's the digital desk. And but then I have this other desk, and that's the analog desk. And nothing electronic other than a pencil sharpener is allowed on that desk. And that's where I keep my notebooks and my pen pens and like sticky notes and glue sticks and scissors. It's like craft time, right? Anything that'd be out on a craft desk in a preschool, basically, that's on the analog desk. And what I do throughout the day is when I'm really like sort of bombed out on the digital desk, I hop over to the analog desk and I just play for a while. Right? I just take 10 or 15 minutes to sort of play, pretend I'm back in preschool. And a lot of times what will happen is I'll get a decent idea on the analog desk, and then I'll move over to the digital desk and execute it. I think execute is a really funny word for creative work. You ever think about that? Like once you execute something, it's dead to you? I think about that a lot. So think about this, if you can, in your studios, right? Like digital desk, analog desk. I think there's something really powerful about just moving in between spaces. You know, like when you're in your house and you need something on the other side of the house, and by the time you get to that room, you forgot what that thing was you were looking for, right? I think that works in creative work to your benefit. I think simply by getting up and moving to a different space, you get out of that zone you were in and you get into a new one. So think about setting up different spaces to do different kinds of work. Number 5, side projects and hobbies are important. So you've probably noticed this in your careers. It's sort of when you're just kind of messing around, that's sort of when the good stuff starts to happen, right? I'm a big fan of what I call productive procrastination. And what I do is I keep 1 or 2 projects going at one time, all the time. And when I get bogged down with one project, I sort of do what I do between the analog and the digital desk, right? I go from one project and I hop over to the other one. Use that project to procrastinate. And then when I'm sick of that project, I hop back over to the one I was procrastinating on, right? If I do this long enough, both projects get done, believe it or not. So think about that, productive procrastination. Also, it's a good thing. We used to have hobbies in this country. Now we're supposed to have, well, in many countries. I forgot I was not in the US for a minute. Whew. I just got off this 25-city book tour, so I'm like in US city mode. But here we are in Vancouver. It's probably the same here, right? Used to have hobbies. Now we're supposed to have side hustles, right? You're supposed to monetize your passion. Do what you love, right? You know, the easiest way to hate something that you love is to turn it into your job, right? We know this. Beware of turning hobbies into jobs, because guess what happens afterwards? You gotta find a new hobby, right? You might be better off keeping that hobby, that passion, just a hobby. You gotta keep things in your life that just feed you and only give and don't take. All right, number 6, share your process. So when an artist talks about their work, they really could be talking about 2 different things, right? So there's the artwork, right? That's the noun. That's the thing that sort of hangs up in the gallery space, right? The thing hanging on the wall that everyone sort of admires, the finished artwork. But then there's the artwork, right? The work of art. That's everything that went into that piece of art, right? That's the sketching, getting the ideas, coming up with the materials, putting the thing together. As with all work, right, there's the process and there's the product. So let's talk about the creative process for a minute, because I think it's so, people talk about the creative process. Like it's this big lofty thing. Here's how I think my personal creative process goes, right? It sort of looks like this. And I stole this from my friend Maureen McHugh. She's a wonderful science fiction writer. If you need a good read, look up her great book, Mothers and Other Monsters. That's a great title, right? All right, so here's how Maureen and how I think that creative work, this is how a project usually goes, right? This is the best idea ever, right? Everybody in the meeting is super excited. The big light bulbs go up. This is the best idea ever. Okay, let's get to work. Okay, this is harder than I thought, right? But you have to keep working, because that's our job. You gotta keep working. And then you get to this point. This is gonna take some work, right? Keep working a little bit. This sucks and it's boring. And you keep working a little bit because you got to. And then you get to this point. This is what I call the dark night of the soul. This is like that scene in Top Gun where Goose is out in the hallway and asks Maverick, Tom Cruise's character, if he still has the number for that truck driving school, right? You're like, I picked the wrong career, I married the wrong person, I moved to the wrong city, what am I doing with my life? This is a crucial part of every project, right? Because if you just get through this moment, things will start to pick up a little bit, right? It will be good to finish this because I'll learn something for next time. So you just keep working. And eventually, at the very end, you got to have a deadline, right? That's another thing. We talk about execution of process, right? And then deadline. Right? You're gonna be dead, so you better finish it, right? Get to the deadline. No, when you get to that deadline, you start out with these great lofty notions, right, of what it's gonna be, and then you go through the dark night of the soul, and then you hit somewhere right in between, right? Not as bad as I thought. Okay, and this is pretty much every book I've ever worked on, every piece of art I've ever made, every client project I ever did when I had a day job, like this was it, the life of a project. Process is messy. Right? Our processes are messy. Now, traditionally, we've been taught that this stuff, you keep this hidden. You don't show anybody this stuff, right? You keep your process hidden and you only show your product. I think in this day and age where we have the ability to share anything we want with anyone we want, I think sharing our process takes on this really powerful, powerful role. I think if you show your process as you go, these little bits and pieces of your process, I think it adds value to the work. Okay, so I encourage you, think about how you can take people behind the scenes with your work. And this starts out by, becoming a documentarian of what you do. Take a week and start listing all the stuff you do in your work. Just like keep a journal or a logbook or something. Start writing down the things you do and start taking pictures of your process. You'll end up with all this sort of rich material, these sort of byproducts of the process that you didn't necessarily know you have. And you can figure out ways to sort of repitch this stuff and share it with people that adds value to the work that you do. And so here's a couple of other ways you can share your process. Tell good stories. We hear this all the time. There's always some speaker on stage talking about telling good stories, right? Okay, but I think there's a different way to think about story. I have a feeling a lot of you are very visual here, right? Now, work doesn't speak for itself. You hear that all the time. My work speaks for itself, right? No, it doesn't. You ever been in a client meeting and tried that? Here's a project. Work speaks for itself. Give me your check, right? Now, the stories we tell about our work give that work meaning. It changes the way people feel about our work. So if you're in control of the story you tell about your work, you're sort of guiding how people perceive it. Now, what I said earlier about visual, there was a great writer named Kurt Vonnegut, who I'm sure you've heard of. Vonnegut thought about stories in very visual terms. So we're at a design conference. I have a feeling this might appeal to you all. What Vonnegut thought is you could graph every story and kind of give an idea of what the structure was like. So he used this axis. There's a beginning and end of every story, and there's every character in the story goes through good fortune and bad fortune. And what he would do is he would draw these stories. So here's one story, very famous story. Man in hole, all right? Character's going along, gets into trouble, gets back out again. Sort of looks like the creative process, right? It's also every romantic comedy you've ever seen, right? Girl meets girl, girl loses girl, girl gets girl back again, all right? This is Cinderella, okay? Cinderella, she's having a really bad time. Things are very bad for Cinderella. Then, all of a sudden, her fairy godmother shows up. She gets some helpers. She gets a carriage. She gets a nice dress. She goes to the ball. She meets the prince. And then midnight strikes, right? Things are very bad for Cinderella. Oh, look, but here comes the prince with the glass stripper. Glass. Yeah. Glass slipper. He comes. Happily ever after again, right? Okay, that's Cinderella. This is Kafka's Metamorphosis. Things just get worse. Okay, but Vonnegut's point was structure is the most important thing about stories. So if you study stories, if you get a feeling for how stories work, then you can steal some of those structures to use in your own work. Finally, there's a form of sharing that I think is one of the most noble and good forms of sharing, and that is teach what you know, right? Teaching is a very noble form of sharing. I look up to these people. Particularly Snoop Dogg, but Bob Ross and Martha Stewart made their fortunes teaching people, giving knowledge away, and then selling people the tools for them to do it themselves, right? But I've always been interested in teaching. You know, you saw the blackout poems earlier. The process is very transparent, right? It's pretty easy to get started making blackout poems. But one of the joys of my creative life is going around and teaching kids how to make blackout poetry. And usually, like, I just say, hey, sniff a marker and let's go. And then, you know, they come up with this wonderful stuff. But this really interesting thing happened when I started teaching blackout poetry. I decided, hey, there needs to be a place where people can sort of like share their own poems. So I started this site named newspaperblackout.com, and at first, like a lot of things in my life, it started out as like, oh, this would be like user-generated content, right? This would be like a marketing thing. It'd be like, it'll get my name out there and people will subscribe and all that stuff. But this wonderful thing happened when I started this site. People sent me the craziest shit, right? They sent stuff that just blew my mind. I want to show you this one. I want to point this one out. This is a baseball card. Someone's blacked out the character's name to lamp and drawn a lampshade on his head. I would not have come up with that, right? But if I just sat on my process and like not, shared it or whatever, I wouldn't have got some of this wonderful stuff that came in my life. And then this really interesting thing happened. Blackout poetry started making its way out into the world and sort of became this thing outside of me. So if you go on Instagram, there are all these people doing blackout poetry. They have no idea who I am, right? And then this interesting thing happened. You know that something's gone mainstream when old, like, aging rockers do it. So this is Roger Waters' album on the left of Pink Floyd, and this is a letter that U2 sent out to all their fans. I did not do this work. And then here, this is a really fun thing for me now. Blackout poems have made their way back into the New York Times now. So the New York Times just ran a poetry contest for blackout poems, and they used my stuff to like teach kids how it's done. So you have to be ready sometimes for your work when it goes out into the world to sort of have a life of its own. But I get off on this, man. Like, this is so cool. Putting the blackouts in the world has taught me so much more than I would have known just by like sitting on them, right? So this wonderful thing happens when you teach, right? When you share, is that you learn things in return. Every teacher will sort of tell you this, right? And if teaching seems too lofty, like, I just think about sharing, right? Just think about sharing things in ways that would be useful or helpful to other people. All right, number 7, don't turn into a vampire or human spam. Okay, so every genius runs on this like system of stealing and sharing, right? And sometimes things get out of control and these mythical monsters are formed, right, based on how much stealing or sharing they do. So let's start on this side. Let's talk about vampires for a minute. Okay, we quoted Picasso earlier, but Picasso went a little far, right? A lot of people thought he was a vampire, okay? His granddaughter, Marina Picasso, is actually on record as saying that he used to squeeze people out like a tube of one of his oil paints. That's fun, right? So you'd hang out with Picasso all day, and like Picasso, at the end of it, you'd just be this nervous, exhausted wreck, but not Picasso. He'd go back to his studio and paint using all the stuff he'd stolen off of you, right? And most people put up with this because they got to hang out with the great genius, right? But not this dude, Constantine Brancusi. I'm from Texas, so I can mispronounce anything I want. Brancusi hailed from the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, and he knew a vampire when he saw one, right? He was not about to have his life force sucked out of him by a vampire like Picasso. Brancusi, he practiced what I call the vampire test. It's a simple way to know what you should let in and out of your life, and it works on people, places, and things, right? So if after hanging out with a person, place, or thing, you feel full up and full of energy, that thing is probably not a vampire, right? But if after hanging out with a person, place, or thing, you feel totally worn out and depleted, you could just be an introvert and need a nap. Or that thing could very potentially be a vampire, right? Parents, this does not work on children. Children are vampires. They will suck you dry. You just deal with it. That's part of the job. I can see y'all making a list right now, right? Vampire test. So the vampire test, easy way to know who you should let in and out of your life. If you find a vampire in your life, do your best to do what Brancusi did, banish it forever. All right, so that's vampires. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the mythical being called human spam. What's human spam? You guys have been on Facebook. You know human spam, right? Human spam are those people in your office who want to tell you all their great ideas and they never want to listen to yours, right? They're the people in college who gave you flyers to their gigs but then never showed up to your gig, right? People who want to talk and don't listen, right? If you should feel like you are turning into human spam when you're sharing your work, there's a simple formula for course correcting. It is shut up and listen, all right? I always want to start my talks with Q&A because then I figure if there's enough good questions, I don't have to actually talk. But that never works. So anyway, if you feel like you're turning into human spam, shut up and listen, right? Okay, so in between these mythical beasts, the people who steal too much and the people who share too much, there's this really sweet spot for the rest of us, and that is a contributor, right? That's a person in the scenius. We share things, but we also take things in, right? We sort of, this is what contributors are, what a good, healthy scenius runs on. Number 8, the ordinary plus extra attention equals the extraordinary. Okay, so if one of my favorite artists ever, she was a nun, okay? Her name was Corita Kent, and she taught at Immaculate Heart in Los Angeles. And in the 60s, she saw the screen printing show by this guy named Andy Warhol, right? And she got super into it and started making her own pieces. And what Corita would do is she would go around Los Angeles and take pictures of signage and packaging and all sorts of different advertising. And she would pull out the latent religious messages in a lot of this work. So for example, she'd take a picture of the Safeway sign and she'd sort of blow it up and crop it and add these beautiful colors. And she often hand-lettered quotes from some of her favorite writers. So this is a Martin Luther King quote next to the Safeway sign. Turns into a message about safe passage, right? She would take the G from the General Mills logo and blow it up and make it stand for God, right? The big G stands for goodness. She would take a bag of Wonder Bread and turn it into a bunch of different pieces, sort of symbolizing the Eucharistic messages in there, like taking communion, Wonder Bread, the wonder of bread. You know, the task of a religious believer is often to find the God in everything. And Corita found it in advertising, which I think makes her a great artist. But this requires like a really specific way of paying attention, right? It requires a specific way of looking. And Corita taught this way of looking to her students. She had this great finder assignment where she'd take like an index card or a piece of cardstock, and they'd cut out a square about the size of a 35 millimeter slide. And they go around cropping the world, paying really a close attention to the things in their environment that they usually just overlooked. And the thing I take from Corita's work, the great message is, everything you need to make extraordinary work can be found in your ordinary life. We all think, right, if I could just move to Paris, you know, rent that light-filled studio on the river, fall in with a gang of misfits, you know, maybe buy a beret, you know, then I could paint my masterpiece, right? It's wishful thinking. You have what you need. Number 9, be boring. Hopefully I haven't done this morning, but be boring. It's the only way to get work done. You know, a lot of people come to me at the beginning of their careers, and, you know, a lot of people, they just feel like if they could just get 10 years or like, you know, just this big chunk of time, right, that they could just like figure it all out. And I think everyone overestimates what like a full, like a 24/7 life, you know, for 10 years will do versus simply something small every day over time. time. I think little bits and pieces of effort over time, they add up into something big. And so like if you write a page every day, it just doesn't feel like much, right, as a writer. But then you write a page 365 days a year, you've got enough for a book every year, right? So little bits and pieces over time, they add up into something big. The problem with this is you got to stick around long enough, right, for that work to add up into something. And this sticking around requires taking care of yourself, right? Neil Young said it was better to burn out but to fade away, right? He's old now. Right? He didn't pay attention to his own words, right? He stuck around. He took care of himself, right? Patti Smith, she says, go to the dentist. That's what she tells young people, right? Go to the dentist. Take care of your teeth. Stay healthy. Eat right. Do some push-ups. Take care of yourself. We want you around for a while. Get counseling. Get therapy. Figure out your mental, spiritual, physical health, right? Stay healthy. Don't burn the midnight, oil or whatever. Get enough sleep. Take care of yourself. We want you around long enough to watch those little bits and pieces of effort, those days. They stack up into something over time. You just got to stick around. All right, number 10. Whew, we made it. Okay, creativity is subtraction. So to illustrate this point, I want to tell you a story about Dr. Seuss. Okay, so Dr. Seuss put out The Cat in the Hat, 236 words. Right? You probably have heard this story. Puts out Cat in the Hat, 236 words. His editor, like great editors, he was good at psychological warfare, And he said to Dr. Seuss, he said, oh yeah, 236 words. I bet you can't write a book with 50 words, only 50 words. And Dr. Seuss, he turned around and he wrote Green Eggs and Ham, right? One of the greatest selling children's books of all time. The point of that story, I think, is that constraints are what make for good creative work, right? If you feel like you have endless possibilities, that just paralyzes you, right? We need to put some constraints on our work. Constraints give us freedom, right? They give us the freedom to harness our creativity and to make good choices and to make good work. And just as we need to put some constraints on our creative work, you also need to put some constraints on your life, right? Because creativity is not just about what you throw in the pot, it's also what you choose to leave out, right? So living a creative life, it means you're not going to be able to do some things. You got to give up some things in order to have the time to do your great creative work. So I hope you will choose what to leave out, and I hope you will choose wisely and have fun, and thank you for listening to me this morning. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks. I'll see you all around. I'll see you at lunchtime. Thank you.